On October 21, 1939, the Philippines Free Press published an article titled Primer on the Plebiscite, which provided a rundown on the economic questions put before the people. This was actually the first time they were called upon to do something and vote on something concerning the Constitution. Now, it turned out that economic provisions were less contentious before the war than political provisions would become. Now, with regards to the political structural debate, they centered in turn on two debates. The first was the term of the chief executive, and the second, unicameralism versus bicameralism. Now, the first glimmerings of public opinion, a force that has become very potent in terms of any charter change debate, emerged by means of polling that began and which could be seen in the national debate over term limits and the restoration of the Senate. So, by means of this debate, the issues having been joined, the question was how would the administration of the day accomplish its objective of amending the Constitution? In July 1939, a menu of options was provided to sound out public opinion and as the party platform. The first was to change the presidential term from one 6-year period to 2 4-year periods. The second was to revive the old bicameral legislature. The third was to create an administrative body to take charge of all elections. The fourth was to revise local governments to make them more responsible and efficient. In other words, to have appointive instead of elected mayors and governors. And the fifth was to readjust the 3-year term limit of assemblymen and provincial and municipal officials so as to make them fit the new proposed 4-year presidential term. The sixth was to reaffirm loyalty to the coalition platform, including independence in 1946. Now, the whole menu being proposed and being called by Speaker Yulo a series of conservative reforms, which public opinion reacted to through a free press straw vote on re-election in October 1939, which showed the public at the time was opposed to re-election. However, by a year later, in 1940, the amendments had been boiled down to 4. The first was to change the president's term from 6 years, no re-election, to 4 years with 1 re-election, with a special election in 1941 qualifying the incumbent to a 2-year extension to make for 8 years in total. Furthermore, the change in president's term was reflected in the proposed lower house, making the terms of representatives and local officials 4 years instead of the existing 3 years, while senators would be elected for 6-year terms. Now, it was also at this time that the argument of the indispensable man was put forward by the president at the time, Quezon himself. In the 1938 midterm election, for the first time, not a single opposition assemblyman had been elected, the first time this had ever happened in our history and the last. Now, Bettina, would you read what Quezon himself said as a signal to his party mates who now totally controlled the National Assembly, so that their 40-year-old one-party dominance might not be imperiled on the eve of independence? Bettina?
Yes, the only thing that I'm afraid of, he confessed, is that after I leave the presidency, the country may be divided, not along political lines, but on the choice of my successor. The country is not prepared for a great division among our people.
Now, another proposal was restoring the Senate, but on a purely national basis. Unicameralism had only won out in the 1935 Constitutional Convention because the bicameralists were divided on whether the Senate should be elected according to districts, as was the case under the Jones Law, or nationally. Now, one compromise no one had noticed as a result of restoring the Senate was that the restoration of the Senate came at a price. After all, it had to be approved by the National Assembly, which was unicameral, and had to vote for its own abolition. The Congress of the Commonwealth and the Republic henceforth would both have a commission on appointments composed of congressmen and senators in equal measure, which was a deviation from the Jones Law and the American practice that puts the vetting of executive appointments strictly in the hands of the Senate. Now, the third revision to the Constitution that was put forward was establishing a commission on elections. Now, this came at a time when they were also instituting what's called block voting, which made for the kind of equity of the incumbent that remains a reality in other Southeast Asian countries. Now, removing block voting in the early 1950s, however, began a quarter century of erosion of presidential authority that led to parties, among other things, being unable to stand up to Marcos in 1972. And the multi-party system, in turn, has entrenched executive influence on national elections, but in terms of a single person and not the ruling party, which reconfigures with every new presidency. And of course, the fourth is actually the second means of constitutional changes, and this was actually accomplished earlier in 1939, which was to approve the amendments of the Tidings-McDuffie Act to establish preferential trade relations with the United States up to the 1960s. This was the economic aspect of charter change. Now, all of these amendments were approved in a national plebiscite in 1940. Now, if the war hadn't intervened, we would probably have had a political system very similar to the Malaysians and Singaporeans of today, a single-party state with the rules rigged in the favor of the ruling party. Now, with independence finally taking place under Manuel Rojas, and with the issues of the president's term and the legislature's composition having been settled in 1940, the question of economic provisions once more emerged, this time on the basis of the destruction of the economy and infrastructure because of World War II. At the heart of this economic debate was the Bell Trade Act with its so-called parity clause that granted United States citizens equal economic rights with Filipinos, for example, in the exploitation of natural resources. Now, the payment of war damages by the United States, as stipulated in the Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946, was made dependent on Philippine acceptance of the parity clause. Now, the Bell Trade Act itself was approved by the Philippine Congress on July 2, 2 days before independence. But the parity clause, however, required an amendment to the 1935 Constitution's 13th article, which reserved the exploitation of natural resources exclusively for Filipinos. Now, this amendment could be obtained only with the approval of 3/4 of the members of the House and Senate plus a plebiscite. Now, the denial of seats in the House to 6 members of the leftist Democratic Alliance and 3 nationalistas on grounds of fraud and violent campaign tactics during the April 1946 election enabled the administration to gain legislative approval on September 18, 1946. The definition of 3/4 became an issue itself because 3/4 of the sitting members and not the full composition of the House and Senate had to approve the amendment. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the administration's interpretation, where it's just 3/4 of everyone who happens to be there and not 3/4 of the formal composition of both houses. So you can see how crucial the Supreme Court is, not just now, but then, to any move to amending the Constitution. Anyway, in March 1947, the plebiscite on the amendments was held. Only 40% of the electorate participated, which gives us another insight into charter changes, which is it doesn't really excite as many people as elections themselves. But still, the majority of those who did happen to vote approved the amendment. Now, from independence onwards, questions were raised concerning the political structure established under the 1935 Constitution, which was so thoroughly dominated by the presidency. Through a combination of populist democratic rhetoric and weak executive leadership, the concentration of powers in the hands of the presidency was reduced. Briefly, the main reductions were as follows. First, making mayors elected and no longer appointed by the presidents. Hence, the first elected mayor of Manila, Arsenio Lacson, would prove to be a thorn in the side of President Elpidio Quirino and all his successors. Second, the elimination of block voting, reducing party influence in the election of senators, and ushering in the era of media popularity as an antidote to political machinery. Ironically, even as the elimination of block voting weakened party influence, it made presidents even more important to candidates on all levels for palace instead of party support. Third, the gradual limitation of the president's powers to juggle funds. So with the weakened presidency, the stage was set for a showdown between those who wanted to reduce the powers of the office further and holders of that office who wanted to restore and increase their old powers. So when we return, the martial law showdown and its legacy of bogus plebiscites.
Well, the new society has been institutionalized in all possible ways, including through the Constitution and through the statutes, but more than anything else, the most permanent way to institutionalize a new society would be through the daily routine, the motivations, the persuasions, the beliefs, the understandings and the ideology of the individual Filipino. The present efforts show that there has been a